It's a pleasure to be here. So the first thing I want to get out of the way is that this line of research is actually, for lack of a better term, good for our marriage. So I'm actually here on behalf of a co-author team, and I will be speaking about a series of co-authored projects that happen to deal with things that are interesting to us as scholars who come from different fields and who have different methodological backgrounds when it comes to studying Black women in politics in general, and Michelle Obama in particular. And so I figured the thing that I would probably have the most fun doing is just talking about how we got into this line of research together and thinking about how it's been enriching both to our other research agendas and to this thing that we share together as a husband and wife. And so I'm a political scientist, I'm a behaviorist. People who call themselves behaviorists tend to look at survey data for a lot of the things that they care about. And we tend to look at political outcomes, things related to activism primarily. And so I'm a political participation scholar. My spouse is an education policy scholar who looks at African American women in predominantly white institutions across the US. And she's qualitative and I'm quantitative. And so we do a lot of working together in a way that stretches us both intellectually, and we call this line of research our dessert after our meals. And so this is the fun stuff we get to take part in that isn't part of our initial lines of research. So, having said all that, this is what I'm going to be talking about today. Is the volume okay? Can y'all hear me good? Okay. So we have several pieces. 3 of them are published. 1 of them's on its way in the sense that we're still working through some of the ideas of it. And all of the stuff has to do with Michelle Obama, but there are different aspects of her that have interested us as social scientists who come from different areas. And so we're going to be talking about some of that. And I'm going to be speaking to you on behalf of her. So there's some stuff that we've done on what used to be called the image transformation issue that went on during the 2008 campaign. We have some work that looks at Let's Move primarily, but also a little bit about joining forces, 2 of Michelle Obama's policy initiatives that got a lot of pub during the time that she was in office, well, during the time that she was in the East Wing of the White House, right? We have some research that recently came out looking at Michelle Obama's ability to contribute to conversations about Black female role models. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the insights about that. And through all of this, we've been interested in media depictions of Michelle Obama, and we're going to come back to that in a very real way to talk about certain ideas we have about race-gender stereotypes and how they come into contact with conversations that take place on social media about Michelle Obama. All right, so the image transformation stuff came out in 2014. It was our first chance to really jump into this stuff, and we were really proud that we got a chance to show this work off. And I'm going to ask you to think back a little bit. So at one point in time during the 2008 presidential campaign, Michelle Obama was, I guess, reputed to have an image issue in the sense that people were concerned about this image issue primarily because they thought it would have something to do with her husband's prospects for getting elected. But that image issue carried over into the Obama presidency, and we were interested in that image transformation stuff. The quote you see here was from someone being critical of Michelle Obama, but we thought to ourselves, this is a really interesting thing to play around with. And so I'm going to show you a link to a video that kind of summarizes some of the stuff that we found to be interesting.
Oh, John Mayer, what an idiot.
He is always upbeat, particularly about Congress. He sings that song. That's why I knew when people said he sang, I bet he sang Al Green. And then, he does that.
Thank you for your service to your country. All Americans owe patriots like you a debt that can never be repaid. You are a true national treasure.
Well, thank you for noticing, ma'am.
I'm not talking to you, Stephen. I'm talking to Brian.
Hey everybody, congratulations on making it to Makeover Week. You all are showing millions of Americans that each of us can make positive changes in our lives.
All right, we're going to be working out with the First Lady, everyone.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready for a workout, but I will make a complete fool out of myself if it means that more children and families get excited about the idea of incorporating nutrition and fitness into their lives. And thank you so much for coming to the White House and raising awareness for Let's Move.
It was my pleasure. I think,
the most important thing for the kids to learn is that it's all about being active and having fun. It doesn't matter if you won or if you lost, you know?
It matters.
But y'all remember this, right? Like, you remember at one point in time, it was kind of hard to miss the former First Lady on TV. And we call that her movement toward taking over the airwaves and what that means. And what we thought about at the time when we were actually studying this stuff is that one of the criticisms that people made against the former First Lady is that she was doing too much of that. Like, the idea that she was performing more like a celebrity and not enough as whatever a First Lady is supposed to be, right? Like, that's a kind of sliding scale as opposed to what First Lady is supposed to be in the first place, right? But this was great because we thought to ourselves, if the argument is that she's acting in a way that suggests that she's seeking celebrity, then maybe the research on celebrities would be useful for thinking about her. And so we, this was years back, we did a search on the Internet Movie Database, and she's got a page. And folks who care about this kind of stuff do really good jobs of archiving when celebrities go places and do stuff. And so this actually became a source of data for us. And we ended up checking to see whether or not we could match up appearances in time with the periods of time when surveys were out in the field, when Michelle Obama was being rated in terms of her favorability. And so if we took the information from the Internet Movie Database, this was at the time that we were working on this stuff, and we just created a timeline. Like, this information was easy to scrape off the internet. And we were able to show, for example, when it took place and what show it was. And there's not a whole lot that I want you to take from this image, but I want you to see how there were like waves of activity. And the waves of activity kind of cluster around when the campaign seasons were happening. In other words, it makes sense that closer to the 2012 campaign, you saw a lot of activity. And it makes sense that around the time that the 2008 campaign was ramping up, you saw lots of activity. But the whole point of it was we found a way to link this information with survey data from a bunch of polls that were looking at favorability towards the former First Lady, at the time candidate, right? And so this is a handful of the polls that we took. And what we did is we found a bunch of commercial polls, and we found like some of the questions were similar across the polls, and we just got those questions that were similar, and these were these favorability questions, which to a degree are asking how much you like Michelle Obama. And what we ended up doing is looking at this stuff and taking those responses to those questions and summarizing them across polls to see whether or not we could get a graph, like, it's like overview of what her favorability looked like. And it looks as though she was getting more and more favorable ratings. Her polling numbers looked like they were trending upwards over time across a bunch of these polls. That was kind of interesting to us, but that, I guess, would suggest that the logic behind the image transformation was doing its job. What we wanted to really look at was whether or not the appearances had something to do with the uptick in the polling numbers that Michelle Obama was receiving. And rather than show the findings in graph form here, I figured I would give you some of the punchlines about what this research was actually giving us. And we were actually interested in this stuff because we didn't know if the polling numbers were really reflecting this effort, because we weren't really sure if that effort was a sustained effort at the time that we were doing this work. But what we found is that both sides had a legitimate argument. So there were the people that thought that the image transformation was a good idea. And obviously, the people that were working with the media scheduling for the former First Lady thought it was a good idea. That's the reason why there was so much of it, right? But the people who criticized it actually had a point. And the argument that doing a lot of these appearances could have a negative outcome actually is something that we couldn't dismiss entirely. And we ended up concluding from our work in this case that less was more, in the sense that the former First Lady did run the risk of being overexposed if there were lots of appearances happening around the time that surveys were in the field. So there was a possibility of a backlash, but you could treat that a bunch of ways. You could say that maybe she shouldn't have been doing as much of that stuff, or you could say that maybe the efforts didn't have to be as extensive. In other words, maybe 2 or 3 appearances per week would do the job, and 7 or 8 appearances per week wouldn't necessarily be any better, right? Now, like I say, we started this research out because we were just curious about this, and we were looking at a lot of non-academic sources talking about this image transformation stuff, and wanted to see if we could actually bring a social science take to looking at whether or not the image transformation did anything that would be interesting to a political scientist and a person who studies Black women, sometimes in politics, but in society overall. So that's one thing that we were fascinated with, and that kind of got us going. So once we were able to successfully get that paper published, we started thinking to ourselves, maybe we can try some more of these. And the policy stuff was the stuff that Christina Haynes really liked to get into. And now we had an opportunity to see about this policy stuff in a little more detail. And so the two policies we ended up paying attention to were Let's Move and Joining Forces. But that inquiry sort of came out on the heels of what was happening at the time, and this is around the time of the 2012 Democratic National Convention speech, when the term mom in chief started becoming really pronounced, right? People started talking about it in the news, and we thought it was an interesting moment for thinking about how to study Michelle Obama, because this was a moniker that she took on for herself, right? So she started talking about how she wanted to serve in this capacity to the nation, and we thought it would be interesting to think about what that means. And we were especially interested in thinking about how that actually would matter or not when it comes to some of the signature policy initiatives that she wanted to use her platform to support. And so the two platforms, like I said, that we were interested in were Let's Move and Joining Forces. People know more about Let's Move than Joining Forces, but for a reminder, Let's Move was the childhood anti-obesity campaign that Michelle Obama spent a lot of time and energy in the White House working towards. And Joining Forces was a collaboration with Jill Biden that was about supporting military families. So at the time that we were writing this, there are other policy initiatives we could have paid attention to, like Let Girls Learn, for example, which is about literacy and about graduation rates, specifically for women in the United States of color. But at the time, we didn't have a lot of information about that. So these are the two that we're going to talk about. And we wanted to see if mom-in-chief rhetoric, if you can call it that, had any kind of sway over how folks felt about these issues. And the way that we tried to play around with this is we actually wanted to see how the former First Lady wrapped up policy conversations inside of this rhetorical strategy of talking about herself as a mom-in-chief. And so because I got the first paper as a quantitative paper, the second paper had to be qualitative so that we could kind of balance it out. And so this was Professor Haynes' attempt at looking at some information in a more qualitative kind of way. And we used the C-SPAN video library for it. And one of the great things about it is that a lot of her speeches are archived there at the C-SPAN.org website, and we just downloaded the speeches, put the speeches into a format that we could actually transcribe information from them, and we took excerpts from the speeches that we believe speak to these dynamics of mom-in-chief rhetoric being combined with policy speak when it comes to Let's Move and Joining Forces. So in terms of discoveries, it's probably easier for me to show you than to tell you. So I do a lot of bouncing in and out of software, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up. So this is a software package called Deduce. I like it because it's good for, mixed methods research overall, but it's really good for like weirdly formatted sources of data. And so video footage is okay to use in Deduce. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is we saw these themes that emerged from our close looking at of the videos. And those themes that seemed to show up to us were that when the First Lady, for example, talked about Let's Move or Joining Forces, there were these three rhetorical strategies that she would take part in. One of those strategies we call blurring the public with the private. In other words, she would use her platform as the First Lady within the confines of talking about her status as a mom and a spouse, to use that moment to talk about Let's Move and Joining Forces. And I want to give you some examples of what that looks like now. So each of these are like examples of what she was doing when we coded this stuff, thinking about how she would blur the private with the public while talking about Joining Forces.
And I'm going to be especially nice to Molly because her husband commands the Air Force District of Washington. So he not only keeps the skies of Washington safe, but he's responsible for when my husband comes back on fourth on Air Force One. So Holly, you and me, we got to get together and get this thing worked out. And so this would be an example of
the former First Lady having a conversation with someone in the audience, and she did her homework, and she realized that one of the people in the audience was a spouse member who has a very important job as it relates to Air Force One. And she's deliberately striking an interpersonal relationship with that person. Now, the reason for the meeting itself is for joining forces and to raise awareness about it and to get more support for it. But by saying that she wants to be friends with Holly because Holly is one of those people that is really important to her husband's occupation, is her way of personalizing an experience with Holly and blurring the lines between her official role as First Lady and her other role, which as a colleague and friend of people in the area. Now, here's an example. I'm going to show you an example of how this might look when she's talking about let's move. And I'm just going to pick one.
There you go. Thank you. Now we get to work. Thank you, guys.
And so you can't see it too easily, but right after Barack Obama signs a piece of legislation that will actually be useful for Let's Move, she kind of whispers to him, all right, now get to work, right? And she's ribbing him a little bit, right? But that's the kind of relationship that they have where she likes to, and I believe this is actually really important, personalize some of these more ceremonial experiences. And so like the fact that there's a signing that's public, right, is a big deal for the policy aspect of it. But it's also good for her to give her husband a little grief about hurrying up and getting some of this stuff taken care of now that she's done the work to bring it this far, right? And it's a joke, and it's cute, but it's also part of this blurring the private with the public when it comes to her ability to speak to policy issues and push some of those policy issues forward. Now, another example of this is we call this theme that emerged from looking at the videos the I am just like you theme, which I think is a very interesting one because one of the critiques that First Ladies get in general, and that I think Michelle Obama got in particular, is that she was somehow unlike the voters she was supposed to be a spokesperson for. And that could swing in a lot of ways. Like you could think about that in terms of her status and her success professionally. You could think about that in terms of her race. You could think about that in terms of her socioeconomic status. And she spends a lot of time in her recent memoir, Becoming, talking about her blue collar background and how it was difficult to square her blue collar background with some of the more upper middle class trappings of the office of the First Lady. But as a rhetorical strategy, one thing that the First Lady wanted to do is she wanted to convince people that she was much different from the average American. And here are some examples of excerpts from video footage that she uses to help bring this idea home. So we'll start with a couple from the Joining Forces and then move to one from Let's Move. And because there are a lot, I'm just picking one, so I'm just going to pick this one here.
I come as an American, filled with a sense of awe at the heroism of my fellow citizens. I come as a wife, a daughter, and a sister, heartbroken at the loss so many of you have endured. And I come as a mother, thinking about what my daughters and what all of our sons and daughters can learn from the 40 men and women whose memories we honor today. The men and women of Flight 93 were college students and grandparents. They were businessmen, pilots, and flight attendants. There was a writer, an antique dealer, a lawyer, an engineer. They came from all different backgrounds and all walks of life. And they all took a different path to that September morning. But in that awful moment, when the facts became clear and they were called to make an impossible choice, they all found the same resolve. They agreed to the same bold plan. They called the people they loved, many of them giving comfort instead of seeking it, explaining they were taking action and that everything would be okay. And then they rose as one. They acted as one. And together they changed history's course.
I want to stop it there, but This is a powerful one because it's at a ceremony memorializing what happened in September 11, 2001. And the speech is a good one, but the strategy there is the thing that made us very interested, because there are examples in that speech of Michelle Obama making herself relatable to the people in the audience. And I didn't show you another video, but in one of the videos, she talks about her father being ex-military. But she grew up in the house with her father, so he was finished with his active duty when she was a small child. And she actually humbles herself before some of the military family members who didn't have it as good as she did. In other words, their folks were deployed while they were kids, and they spent a significant amount of their time not having one of their parents around. And it was her being very serious about these issues, but also her trying to make sure that she knew that she conveyed to them that she respected and appreciated the circumstances that they were in. And even if she couldn't completely and utterly relate to those circumstances, she was making an effort to relate to those circumstances. In other words, she was trying to convey to the best that she could that she wasn't much different from the people in the audience that might be suffering from things that are very unique to them. I'm just going to pick the second one as an example of how this looks in Let's Move.
See, as you know from that last night, I get embarrassed when people stand up and talk for me. I don't really know what to do. Do I wave? Do I just like, please just sit down, everyone?
And so this is her showing vulnerability to a crowd, right? Kind of letting folks in the crowd know, like, I'm not really comfortable with some of the formality that y'all put into these press events. And these things make me not know what to do with myself. And that's another one of these approaches. And I'm not saying that all of this stuff is solely like all strategic, right? But as rhetorical strategies, these are interesting strategies to employ when you're trying to convince people that you're not much different than them, right? Because regular folks get nervous around times when they have cameras in front of them too, right? And so these would be ways of thinking about how the excerpts tell us something about how Michelle Obama used "I am just like you" types of messages wrapped up in instances where policy is being discussed. Now, finally, there was a theme that emerged that we found to be really interesting, and it's the Moms Unite theme. It's the idea that motherhood is a cross-cutting social identity that you can use to unify people across different demographic and political groups. And I'm going to show you an example of how that looked in Joining Forces, and then show you how that might look in Let's Move.
Groups, their families, their advocates, thanks for joining us as we make an unprecedented commitment to America's military families. Now, last month,
Sorry. That was Ms. Caroline.
Enough fiber and enough vegetables and fruits. And we have to be educated about what that diet should look like. And then we have to start making choices to not have candy every day, even if you can. To not ask for those desserts all the time, even if you can. To think about, learning how to cook for yourselves, how to bake a chicken and make a little pasta, how to think about putting more water in your diet, Those are decisions at your age. You're the age of enough fiber.
And in this example, she's talking about what it's like to cook for a kid, right? The kind of challenge that a parent would have when they're thinking about what they could do in real time to make a diet more nutritious and to make the routine around eating in a household something that supports a more healthy lifestyle going forward. Now, I mention all of this because this was our attempt to use data from the C-SPAN video archive as a way of thinking about how conversations about policy can intersect with conversations that relate to this mom-in-chief identity that the former First Lady had taken for herself. And this project allowed us to look at another source of data to think about how that might actually play out. The current project that I'm telling you about got published as a book chapter in an edited volume about using C-SPAN videos as a source of social science data. But we have other projects spinning off from this that are going to allow us to connect the use of policy rhetoric to people's feelings about Let's Move and about joining forces. So The last thing I'll talk about, I guess in detail, is the role model status paper. This thing just recently came out, I think last month, in Politics and Gender. And it really does stem from some of the conversations that Michelle Obama had in her memoirs. But we're thinking about them even before that, because there were a bunch of anecdotal things going around about Michelle Obama's ability to have this kind of impact as a role model. And we were thinking about what that means in particular. And so what we think it means is that in 2009, in an interview with Essence Magazine, Michelle Obama acknowledges how important it is to serve as a role model. And political figures serve in that capacity. It's not unusual for a political figure to say that they want to be or that they feel like they need to be a role model. But the uniqueness of Michelle Obama as the first black first lady allows a moment for us to talk about how that has racial implications. And what we ended up studying was the impact of Michelle Obama's status as a role model on how people thought about black women. In other words, we wanted to explore, for example, whether or not opinions about black women in America or impressions of black women in America were affected in a positive way by Michelle Obama being present in politics during the time that she was in the White House and outside of the time in the White House as a prominent social figure. And we had this way of thinking about what that meant. And I call it the Obama effects literature. And this is not unique to Michelle Obama, but a lot of the research on Barack Obama talks about the importance of him being politically prominent, right? And we've seen things that suggest that Barack Obama's political prominence had an effect on test scores. It had an effect on racial attitudes. It had an effect on whether or not people check multiracial categories on the census and other stuff, right? And so that literature on Obama effects, if we bring it over and apply some of the major insights to Michelle Obama as opposed to Barack Obama, we didn't think that there was much that we needed to change about the architecture of that logic. And so what we wanted to do is we took the Obama effects literature and we tried to inform it to the degree that we could. And the Obama effects literature, regardless of Michelle or Barack, is usually talking about the media activity of the Obamas. And ultimately, what we cared about were racial attitudes. And the assumption, of course, is that the reason why there's a relationship between media activity and racial attitudes is because of this understood but not widely tested idea that people assumed a certain role model status for the First Lady. In other words, the First Lady's status as a role model is the thing that helps you to connect the media activities of the First Lady to people's attitudes about race, which is what we were ultimately interested in. And so we were arguing that role model status mediated the relationship between media activity and racial attitudes. But we didn't think that that mediated relationship worked the same way for black women or black men or white women or white men. In other words, we wanted to see the degree to which the ability of role model status to help transmit the effect of media activity to racial attitudes would be influenced by race, gender, demographics. And in the study that we did, we actually found some information for that. And what we found is that role model status worked like a moderated mediator. And what that means is that it did explain the relationship between people's familiarity with Let's Move. We were using a survey, and that was our measure of media activity. In other words, we wanted to know how familiar respondents were with the stuff that Michelle Obama was doing when it comes to Let's Move. Not the best measure, but it was what we had in the survey that we were taking advantage of. And the relationship between that familiarity with Let's Move and people's attitudes about black women actually disappeared once we factored in role model status. In other words, once you start thinking about people's assumptions about Michelle Obama being a role model, then that relationship between media activity and racial attitudes disappears entirely. But that overall result either got bigger or smaller, depending on whether or not you sorted the sample of survey respondents by their race and their gender. And the degree to which policy familiarity in this case explained racial attitudes depended on race primarily, and to a lesser degree by gender. And what we mean by that is that explanation did a really good job of explaining black women's transmission of their familiarity with Let's Move to their racial attitudes. did a really poor job among white men explaining that relationship. And so we found these race-gender differences in this effect. And that gets us to this moderated mediator thing that I'm talking to you about now. So the last 3 projects were things that are out, right? Like you can read them and you can evaluate the merits of them because they're published. Stuff that we're working on now, and I'm kind of giggling because Andra's probably going to hear about this when we go to NCOPES in a matter of days, right? Is that I'm working with a team of co-authors, which includes Christina Haynes, again, and we're looking at race-gender stereotypes. And so I'm putting these images up here because I typically think of these as some of the archetypical stereotypes. So you got Hattie McDaniel, right, is literally Mammy in Gone with the Wind. You have Sapphire Stevens from Amos and Andy, that's the one carrying the telephone, and Pam Grier's rendition of Foxy Brown in the blaxploitation flicks, right? Now, these don't apply directly to Michelle Obama in like this one-to-one sense, but social media accounts have actually used conversations about black women stereotypes and wrapped those around conversations about Michelle Obama. One of the more interesting ones has to do with the Mammy characterization and how that actually showed up in an argument that was taking place between Michelle Cottle and Melissa Harris Perry about whether or not it was a good idea for the former First Lady to declare that she was prioritizing her family over other things during the time that she was in the White House. And so I want to make sure that I give this a little time to play, so I'm going to open this up now. And so the last, like I said, we don't have findings yet, right? We're in the process of figuring out what Twitter can help us to understand about many of the dynamics that Melissa Harris Perry mentions in her rejoinder to Melissa Cottle about the feminism or lack thereof of the First Lady's mom-in-chief move, right? But we think this stuff is really fascinating because for the people who study black women stereotypes, they've existed for a long time, and they're attributed, fairly or not, to people over the course of their prominence in politics. And the ones that typically show up are the ones that talk a little too much about Michelle Obama's body parts, and those sort of get to Jezebel-esque race-gender stereotypes in an interesting and weird sort of way. There's a derivation of the Mammy stereotype known as the black superwoman stereotype, which is something that Michelle Obama talks about very directly in her memoirs, and about how difficult it is to be perceived as someone who should and who can, quote unquote, do it all in a family. And the idea of problematizing feminist critiques of the mom-in-chief move is what Melissa Harris Perry is getting at directly, which brings us back to a conversation about the Mammy stereotype once again. And I don't need to remind you of how many times angry and black and woman were applied to the former First Lady and are still being applied to Michelle Obama to varying degrees even today in political discourse. And so that's essentially what I have. So I came here under the assumption that I would show you some research, and I didn't want to bore you with a lot of the technical details of the research, but I didn't want to leave you with this idea that we learned a great deal from doing this line of research. And so there are the research discoveries that are important, but there's also this idea that we're working across disciplines to study something that we think is really important, and political science should pay more attention to this. Communication studies tends to be the place where we go to get a lot of the information about this stuff. And I just feel good as a person who's speaking on behalf of this particular social science, that the work that my spouse and I are taking care of is actually helping to move conversations forward in our discipline. And in her discipline, these conversations typically happen more often. So it's great to have company now when it comes to these conversations moving on. And so I'm going to stop there and open it up for Q&A. I'm a couple of minutes early. I don't think that's going to be too big of a deal. It's probably better to be early than it is to be late, right? But I'm very curious to hear your reactions to the stuff that's being published already, or the stuff that's going to be coming out, especially about the race-gender stereotypes and what that might look like going forward.